Man carried injured bear for hours to the vet. What happened next shocked everyone. The Montana wilderness stretched endlessly before Ethan Caldwell, an expanse of towering pines and snow-dusted peaks that had become more of a home to him than the walls of any house ever had. The crisp morning air was laced with the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles, the distant call of a raven echoing through the forest. Ethan adjusted the straps of his pack and took a deep breath, relishing the solitude. Out here, away from the noise and rush of civilization, everything made sense. The wilderness was predictable in its unpredictability, a constant test of endurance and respect, a place where every movement had purpose. He had been guiding in these mountains for nearly 15 years, taking hunters, backpackers, and wildlife enthusiasts through the remote trails where cell service was non-existent, and the only law was nature's. It was a life he chose after years in the city had drained something essential from him, a calling he followed with the certainty of a river carving its path through stone. But today was different. Today he was alone, not leading a group, not teaching survival tactics, not charting a route for tourists eager to snap photos of elk and eagles before retreating to their cabins. This was his time, his retreat, a simple scouting trip to check new trails before the first heavy snow made the high country impassable. He moved steadily through the underbrush, boots crunching over frost-kissed leaves, scanning the landscape with the keen eyes of someone who had spent his life reading its unspoken language. A broken branch, fresh claw marks on the bark of a tree, signs of movement, of life, of struggle. Something had passed through recently. Ethan knelt, brushing his fingers over the scratches on the pine's rough surface. The marks were deep, erratic, a predator. He followed the subtle signs with practiced ease, each step measured, ears tuned to the hush of the forest. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a faint, pained whimper carried on the wind. Ethan froze. The forest was full of sounds, the rustling of squirrels, the distant bugle of an elk, the rhythmic tapping of a woodpecker. But this was different. It was small, weak, barely there. Slowly he moved toward the source, weaving between trees and pushing through dense ferns, his heart quickening with each step. He reached a small clearing, and there, nestled against the base of a fallen tree, was the cub. At first glance, it barely looked real, just a dark shape curled in on itself, too still, too quiet. But then another whimper, a slight twitch of its paw. Ethan exhaled slowly, stepping closer. A black bear cub, no older than a few months, its fur thick and glossy despite the dirt clinging to it. But it was hurt. He could see the ragged wound along its side, fresh claw marks slicing through its flank, dried blood crusted around the edges. The cub's breasts were shallow, and even as Ethan approached, it made no attempt to flee. That in itself was a bad sign. A healthy bear cub would bolt at the scent of a human. Ethan crouched, careful not to startle it. He scanned the area, his muscles tensing instinctively. Where was the mother? Black bears were fiercely protective of their young, and stumbling across a cub alone was rare, unnatural. His eyes darted toward the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. No snapping branches, no warning huffs from a hidden sow. Just silence. He looked back at the cub, and realization settled heavily in his chest. It was alone. The wound, the abandoned state, it all pointed to one grim possibility: a mountain lion attack. Cougars and black bears shared these forests, their territories overlapping in uneasy cohabitation. A lone cub, too young to fight back, would have been an easy target. Its mother had either been chased off, wounded, or worse. The thought made Ethan's jaw tighten. The cub lifted its head slightly, its dark eyes meeting his for the briefest moment before it collapsed again, too weak to hold itself up. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. He knew the rules. Wilderness guides, park rangers, survivalists, they all followed the same creed. Do not interfere with nature. Animals lived and died by the laws of the wild, and humans had no right to step in, no matter how harsh it seemed. But staring at the trembling, injured creature before him, Ethan knew he couldn't walk away. His mind raced through the logistics. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was nearly 50 miles away. The terrain between here and there was rugged, unforgiving, and the weather was already shifting. He had limited medical supplies, just the basics. A first aid kit, some antiseptic wipes, a roll of gauze, but nothing designed for treating a bear cub. And even if he got it to the clinic, there was no guarantee they would take it in. Wild animals were not pets, and many places followed strict policies about intervention. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Well, kid," he murmured, "looks like you picked the right day to cross my path." The cub didn't respond, its breath slow, labored. Ethan moved carefully, unfastening his pack and retrieving the gauze. He'd have to clean the wound, at least stop any further infection before making the journey. Dipping a cloth into his water bottle, he dabbed at the dried blood. The cub flinched but didn't resist. Good. It had some fight left in it. The gashes weren't deep enough to be fatal, but they were raw, jagged, likely the result of claws raking down its side in a struggle. Ethan worked quickly, his hands steady despite the cold biting at his fingers. The cub let out a small, pitiful sound as he wrapped the wound with gauze, securing it as best he could. "I know, buddy," he muttered. "Not fun, but it's better than the alternative." He sat back, studying the cub. It was still too weak to move, its body slumped against the fallen log. Ethan weighed his options. Leaving it here meant certain death, whether from infection, starvation, or another predator. Carrying it meant a long, grueling trek through rough terrain. It wasn't a question of if he could do it. He'd carried injured people through worse conditions, but rather if he was willing to risk whatever consequences came with it. The answer was obvious. Ethan secured his pack, adjusting the straps before carefully lifting the cub into his arms. It barely reacted, only a faint groan escaping its throat as its weight settled against him. It was heavier than he expected, solid despite its fragile state. He shifted its body against his chest, making sure not to press against its wound. "All right," he murmured, adjusting his grip. "Let's get you out of here." The forest loomed ahead, dense and unforgiving, the journey before him long and uncertain. But Ethan had made his choice. Turning his back on the clearing, he took his first step into the unknown, carrying the fragile life that now depended entirely on him. The weight of the cub pressed against Ethan's chest as he trudged forward, his boots sinking into the damp forest floor with each step. The cold was settling in now, creeping through his layers and stiffening his muscles, but he ignored it, focusing on the path ahead. The trees stretched endlessly in every direction, towering pines and thick underbrush forming an unbroken labyrinth. Carrying the cub made every step more difficult, his balance shifting with the extra weight. But setting it down wasn't an option. Its breathing was still shallow, and every so often a weak, pained whimper escaped its muzzle, a sound that twisted something deep inside him. He had spent years teaching people how to survive in these woods, how to respect its dangers and abide by the unspoken rules of the wild. And yet, here he was, breaking one of the most sacred rules of all, interfering. The wildlife clinic was still miles away, and with the weather turning, he had to find shelter before nightfall. The cold wasn't the worst of it. Predators prowled these lands, and a defenseless, injured cub was an open invitation for trouble. He adjusted his grip, shifting the cub's weight to his left arm, while his right hovered near the hunting knife strapped to his belt. He didn't like carrying weapons unless absolutely necessary, but out here, caution was survival. The wind picked up, rustling through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and distant rain. It was going to be a long night. He pushed forward, stepping over thick roots and skirting patches of jagged rock, his pace slowing as fatigue crept in. The cub was heavier than he had anticipated, and though it wasn't fully grown, it was still solid muscle beneath its thick fur. He felt its warmth seeping through his jacket, a stark contrast to the bite of the evening air. The quiet between them was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. The silence was unnerving. Normally, the forest was alive with sound. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant cry of a hawk. But now an eerie stillness settled around them, as if the world was holding its breath. A sudden snap in the distance made him stop. He froze, his grip tightening around the cub as his eyes scanned the thick trees. The sound had come from behind him, deliberate, not the random shifting of wind or falling branches. Something was there. He took a slow breath, his heartbeat steady but alert. The last thing he needed was another predator sniffing around. He turned slightly, adjusting his stance, his ears tuned to the faintest sound. Then, another movement, low, rustling, something big shifting in the undergrowth. Not a deer, something heavier, moving with purpose. A predator. Ethan's mind raced through possibilities. Mountain lions were solitary, rarely attacking humans unless provoked. But a hungry one, desperate and territorial, might see him as a threat. Wolves hunted in packs, but they weren't known for targeting people unless food was scarce. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through him. He didn't have the luxury of speed with the cub in his arms. If it came to a fight, he needed to be ready. He slowly backed away, keeping his eyes on the thick brush where the sound had come from. Then just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence. Nothing moved. He waited, his muscles coiled, every sense on high alert. But after a minute, two, nothing came. The forest remained still. Exhaling slowly, he turned and pressed forward, not daring to let his guard down. Whatever it was had either lost interest or was waiting. He needed to get out of here, fast. His legs burned as he picked up his pace, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp evening air. The cub stirred slightly, a faint tremor running through its body, but it remained limp, its strength drained from exhaustion and injury. He pushed on for what felt like hours, his body aching with every step. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and purple, casting long shadows through the trees. He needed shelter. Now his mind quickly mapped the area, recalling an overhang near the river a few miles south. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. He adjusted his course, angling toward the water, his boots crunching over dry leaves and damp soil. By the time he reached the rocky outcrop, the sky had darkened, the first stars blinking into existence above the towering pines. He set the cub down carefully, easing it onto a patch of dry moss near the base of the rock wall. It barely moved, its eyes half-lidded, breath slow but steady. He pulled off his pack and quickly set to work, gathering dry wood and kindling, his fingers working deftly despite the cold. Within minutes, a small fire flickered to life, casting a warm, golden glow against the stone. Ethan sat back on his heels, watching as the cub stirred slightly, its ears twitching at the crackling flames. He reached for his water bottle, pouring a small amount into his cupped hand, then carefully brought it to the cub's nose. It sniffed weakly before lapping at the water, its tongue rough against his skin. Encouraged, Ethan pulled out a protein bar from his pack, breaking off a small piece and holding it out. The cub hesitated, its dark eyes studying him before slowly taking the offering. It chewed sluggishly, its body still too weak for much movement, but it was something. He leaned back against the rock, stretching out his sore legs, watching the flames dance in the dim light. The cub let out a soft, contented sound, something between a sigh and a hum, before resting its head against the moss. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. He had a long way to go, but for now they were safe. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the distant cry of an owl, but here, within the glow of the fire, the night felt quieter, calmer. Ethan stared at the cub, watching its chest rise and fall, feeling the weight of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. He had broken the rules today, crossed a line he had sworn not to cross, but looking at the small, fragile creature before him, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. The cub was still alive, and as long as it was, he wouldn't stop fighting for it. The fire flickered against the cold stone, casting long shadows that danced across the rocky overhang where Ethan sat, his back pressed against the uneven wall. The weight of exhaustion was beginning to settle into his bones, his muscles aching from the long trek with the cub in his arms. But his mind refused to rest. His eyes remained on the small bundle of fur lying beside the fire. The cub's slow, shallow breaths a reminder of just how fragile its life still was. Every now and then, it twitched, shifting slightly in its sleep, its tiny body instinctively curling in on itself for warmth. The wound along its side was clean now, wrapped in the best bandaging Ethan could manage with the limited supplies in his pack. But the real challenge was yet to come. It needed food, real food, something more than the tiny bits of a protein bar he had been able to offer. Water alone wouldn't keep it alive, and he knew that by morning, if it didn't regain some strength, the trek ahead would be even harder. The wind howled through the trees beyond the shelter, rustling branches and sending a biting chill through the air, but the fire held steady, crackling softly against the silence of the forest. Ethan reached into his pack, fingers brushing against the emergency ration he kept for himself. A vacuum-sealed pack of dried venison, not ideal for an injured cub, but better than nothing. Tearing off a small piece, he held it near the cub's nose, watching as its nostrils twitched slightly at the scent. It stirred, eyelids fluttering, but made no move to eat. Ethan sighed, placing the meat down within reach before rubbing his hands together, feeling the stiffness settling in from the cold. He knew better than to get attached. This was not a pet, not some stray dog he could nurse back to health and keep by his side. This was a wild animal, one that belonged out here, and yet, looking at the tiny creature lying so helplessly beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had made their paths cross for a reason. Ethan had spent most of his life in the wilderness, had seen the way nature dictated its own rules. Rules that didn't care for fairness or mercy. The weak perished, the strong survived. And yet, here he was, breaking the natural order, going against the very laws he had lived by for years. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the cub had looked at him back in that clearing. Those dark, frightened eyes silently pleading for something it didn't even understand. Maybe it was the knowledge that if he left it behind, its fate was already written in blood. Or maybe deep down, it was something he wasn't ready to admit to himself, that in saving the cub, he was trying to save something in himself too. A sharp snap of a branch in the distance jolted him from his thoughts. Instinct took over in an instant. He reached for the knife at his belt, muscles tensing as he listened. The fire crackled, but beyond it, the forest was unnervingly silent. Then another sound, a rustling in the underbrush, slow and deliberate. Something was watching them. He rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle whatever was lurking in the darkness. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, for the faintest glint of eyes reflecting the fire's glow, but he saw nothing. The cub stirred slightly, letting out a soft, weak whimper, and Ethan shifted closer, his free hand instinctively pressing against its side as if to shield it. Then, the silence broke. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness, deep and menacing, the kind that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. His grip tightened on the knife. Mountain lion. The realization struck him cold. It wasn't uncommon to encounter one out here, especially at night when they were most active. But the fact that it was this close, circling just beyond the fire's light, meant one thing. It wasn't just passing through. It had caught the scent of blood. It knew the cub was weak, and it was waiting. Ethan's mind worked quickly, weighing his options. Running wasn't one of them. Not with the cub in this state, not in the dark where uneven ground could send him tumbling in an instant. Climbing was useless. Mountain lions could scale trees better than he ever could. That left one choice, making himself a threat. He took a slow step forward, keeping the fire between him and the unseen predator, his voice low but firm as he shouted into the trees, "Get out of here!" The growl didn't stop. If anything, it grew deeper, more persistent. The predator wasn't easily intimidated. Ethan knew he had one advantage, the fire. Mountain lions were cautious by nature, reluctant to engage when the odds weren't in their favor. He grabbed a thick branch from the pile of unburned wood and shoved one end into the flames, letting it catch. The fire flared as embers shot into the air, and as he lifted the burning branch, the glow finally illuminated what had been stalking them. Just beyond the tree line, a pair of golden eyes gleamed in the darkness, locked onto them with predatory intent. The lion was massive, its tawny coat blending seamlessly with the night, muscles rippling beneath its fur as it crouched low, tail twitching. It was close, too close. If it decided to attack, Ethan wouldn't have much time to react. He took a step forward, raising the burning branch higher, his voice sharp and commanding. Go! Now! The fire crackled in his grip, the flames licking at the wood, sending a warm glow against the surrounding trees. For a moment, the lion hesitated, its ears twitching back, its gaze flickering between Ethan and the cub. Then, with a final, lingering growl, it stepped backward, melting into the darkness the way only mountain lions could, silent, ghost-like, disappearing as if it had never been there. Ethan didn't lower the torch until he was sure it was gone. Only then did he exhale, his muscles slowly unclenching, his pulse still thrumming against his ribs. He turned back toward the cub, which had barely moved, its small body still too weak to react. "You really aren't making this easy, are you?" he muttered, kneeling beside it once more. He placed the burning branch near the fire, letting it smolder safely as he reached for his pack again, pulling out a thicker blanket to drape over the cub's frail body. The night stretched on, the adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by the weight of exhaustion. He leaned back against the rock, watching the fire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness return in cautious whispers. The cub let out another weak breath, its small body finally relaxing against the warmth of the blankets. Ethan let his own eyes drift shut for a moment, the events of the day pressing heavily against his thoughts. The journey wasn't over. The hardest part was still ahead. But for now, in the glow of the fire, under the endless stretch of Montana sky, they had survived. And for tonight, that was enough. The first pale light of dawn crept through the thick canopy, casting a cold silver glow over the forest floor as Ethan stirred from his uneasy rest. His body protested as he moved, sore muscles stiff from a night spent in vigilance. But he ignored the discomfort, his first thought settling on the cub. It was still curled beneath the blanket he had draped over it, its small body rising and falling with each breath. The fire had burned low, reduced to little more than glowing embers, but it had done its job, keeping them warm, keeping predators at bay. Ethan let out a slow breath, rubbing his face with his hands, trying to push away the lingering exhaustion. There was no time to waste. The longer they lingered here, the harder the journey would become. And if the cub had any chance at survival, he needed to get it to the clinic before infection set in. He reached into his pack, pulling out what little food he had left, a handful of dried venison, a half-eaten granola bar. Not much, but enough for the day if he rationed carefully. He tore a small piece of the venison, holding it near the cub's nose, waiting for a reaction. At first, there was nothing, just the slow rhythm of its breathing, but then its nostrils flared slightly, and after a few seconds, its dark eyes fluttered open. A weak, barely audible whimper escaped its throat as it shifted, attempting to move but faltering almost instantly. Ethan felt a small surge of relief. At least it was still fighting. "Come on, kid," he murmured, inching the meat closer. "You need to eat." The cub hesitated, staring at him with unfocused eyes before its mouth opened just enough to take the food. It chewed slowly, every movement sluggish, but it was eating. That was something. Ethan gave it water next, carefully tipping his bottle to let a few drops trickle onto its tongue, watching as it swallowed with difficulty. It wasn't enough to give it strength, but at least it wasn't shutting down. He glanced up toward the sky, the light of morning breaking fully now, the crisp mountain air carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. He needed to move. Rising to his feet, he stretched his sore limbs before kneeling beside the cub once more, securing the blanket around its small body before carefully lifting it into his arms. It made a faint noise, a weak protest, but it didn't resist as he cradled it against his chest. "Let's get you out of here," he muttered, adjusting his grip before setting off through the trees. The morning was silent, the forest still waking from the long night. Every step was calculated, his boots finding purchase on the uneven ground as he navigated the thick underbrush, mindful of the cub's weight in his arms. It was heavier than it looked, its solid form pressing into him as he moved, but he had carried worse. His body had long since adapted to endurance, to pushing through exhaustion when the situation demanded it. He focused on his breathing, on keeping a steady pace, eyes scanning the landscape ahead. The clinic was still a day's trek away, maybe more if the terrain worked against him, but he had no choice but to keep going. Hours passed in a slow, grueling blur, the weight of the cub growing heavier with each mile. The morning sun had climbed higher now, its golden light filtering through the trees, but the air remained cold, the lingering bite of winter ever present. Ethan pushed forward, stopping only when absolutely necessary, pausing to adjust his grip or to check on the cub, which had remained mostly still in his arms. It was conserving energy, its body weak but no longer completely lifeless, its breath steadier than they had been the night before. That was the only reassurance he had as he pressed on, every muscle in his body aching under the strain. By midday, he reached the river. It stretched wide and fast before him, its waters clear but unforgiving, rushing over jagged rocks with a relentless current. He had known this crossing was coming, had prepared himself for it, but now, standing at the edge, the cub in his arms, he hesitated. Normally, he would have waded through without a second thought, the cold barely a concern, but with the added weight in the cub's condition, the risk was greater. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and they would both be swept downstream. His grip tightened around the cub instinctively, his mind working through the best approach. He moved upstream, searching for a narrower section, a place where the current wasn't as fierce. Finally, he found it. A crossing of large, moss-covered stones jutting from the water, forming a natural bridge. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than fighting the full force of the river. Taking a deep breath, he shifted the cub in his arms, tightening his hold before stepping onto the first rock. His boots slipped slightly against the slick surface, but he adjusted quickly, steadying himself before moving to the next. The water roared beneath him, the sound deafening, but he kept his focus forward, muscles tensed with each careful step. Halfway across, his foot landed on a loose stone. It shifted, he lurched, his balance tilting dangerously as his free arm flailed for stability. The cub let out a weak cry, sensing the sudden shift, but Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing his weight back, stabilizing just before he could go down. His pulse hammered in his ears as he took another breath, exhaling slowly before moving again, his steps more careful than ever. The final leap to solid ground came with a surge of relief, his boots landing firmly on the other side. He adjusted his grip on the cub, feeling the faint tremor in its body, its fear mirroring his own. "We're all right," he muttered, though whether he was saying it for the cub or himself, he wasn't sure. The afternoon wore on, the journey becoming nothing more than a test of endurance. His arms ached from carrying the cub, his legs burned from the relentless incline, but he didn't stop. The clinic was still miles away, but he refused to entertain the idea of failure. The cub's breaths remained steady against his chest, its warmth a small reminder of why he was pushing himself to the limit. He didn't care about the rules, about what he was supposed to do. This wasn't about logic anymore. It was about instinct, about the simple, undeniable fact that he couldn't let this creature die alone in the wilderness. As the sun dipped lower, he spotted it, his destination for the night. A small, abandoned ranger's outpost, barely more than a shack, tucked into the dense tree line. Relief flooded through him as he quickened his pace, reaching the worn wooden structure just as exhaustion threatened to take over completely. He nudged the door open with his boot, stepping inside to find dust-covered furniture, old supply crates, and a stone fireplace that had long since gone cold. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Carefully, he set the cub down on a pile of blankets he had pulled from his pack, watching as it curled into itself, its small body sinking into the warmth. He moved on instinct, gathering wood from the pile outside, stacking it into the fireplace before striking a match. The flames caught quickly, casting the room in a soft, golden glow, chasing away the chill. Ethan sat back, rubbing his sore arms, watching the cub's chest rise and fall with slow, steady breaths. He wasn't sure if it truly understood what was happening, if it knew that he had risked everything to get it this far. But as its dark eyes blinked open for a brief moment, looking at him with something almost like recognition, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't done yet. The fire crackled softly in the small outpost, its golden glow casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Ethan sat with his back against the rough planks, exhaustion pressing against him like a heavy weight. But he refused to let sleep take him yet. His eyes remained fixed on the cub, still nestled within the blankets, its breath slow but steady, its small body rising and falling in the dim light. The warmth of the fire had done its job, chasing away the biting cold, And for the first time since he had found it, the cub looked truly at peace. Ethan let out a quiet breath, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the raw ache of fatigue settle into his bones. He had come so far, pushed through so much, and now the clinic was within reach. One more day, maybe less if the terrain was forgiving, and he could place the cub in hands more capable of saving its life. That thought should have brought him relief, should have reassured him that he had done the right thing. But instead, a strange tightness settled in his chest. He had never planned to form an attachment, had never intended to let himself care beyond the simple act of survival. Yet here he was, staring at this fragile creature with something dangerously close to protectiveness. He shook his head at himself, exhaling slowly as he adjusted his position, stretching out his legs and letting the warmth of the fire seep into his weary muscles. The wind howled outside, rattling against the walls, but inside the outpost remained still, a cocoon of warmth and quiet. Ethan's fingers absently traced the edge of the blanket he had wrapped around the cub, his thoughts drifting despite himself. He had spent years in these forests, walking the line between man and wilderness, always respecting the unspoken rules that govern both. He had seen life and death play out countless times, had watched as nature made its choices without mercy or hesitation. But this was different. This wasn't some abstract rule of survival. This was a life he had chosen to fight for, a creature he had carried through miles of unrelenting terrain because something deep inside him refused to let it die alone. That realization sat heavy in his chest as he leaned his head back against the wood, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the cub's breathing. The hours stretched on, the fire burning low, his exhaustion pulling at the edges of his mind. But just as he was about to let sleep take him, a soft sound stirred him back to awareness. A whimper, faint, barely there, but enough to make his body tense. He shifted forward, his focus immediately back on the cub, watching as it stirred weakly, its eyes blinking open. For the first time since he had found it, those dark eyes held something other than pure exhaustion. There was recognition now, a flicker of awareness as it lifted its head slightly, sniffing at the air before glancing toward him. Ethan remained still, barely breathing, letting it take in his surroundings without pressure. Slowly the cub shifted, struggling to move, but there was strength in its small limbs now, a determination that hadn't been there before. Ethan reached out, hesitating for only a second before running a careful hand over its head. The cub flinched at first, but then, after a moment, it leaned into the touch, pressing its small body against his fingers. A slow, unexpected warmth spread through Ethan's chest, something deep and unfamiliar, something he couldn't name. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice low, rough from exhaustion. "You're gonna be okay." The cub let out a small sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper, just something that felt like acknowledgement. Ethan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head at himself. He needed to rest. Morning would come soon, and then it would be time to move again. But even as he closed his eyes, even as sleep finally pulled him under, the last thing he felt was the soft weight of the cub curled against him, its warmth a steady reminder that for now it was still here. By the time dawn broke, the fire had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin bathed in the soft glow of morning light. Ethan stirred, stretching out his stiff limbs before glancing down at the cub, surprised to find it already awake, its dark eyes blinking up at him. The sight sent a wave of relief through him. Whatever strength had returned last night had not faded. If anything, the cub looked stronger, more alert. He sat up slowly, reaching for his pack, pulling out what little food remained. "All right, kid," he murmured, breaking off a small piece of venison and holding it out. "One last meal before we get moving." The cub hesitated, sniffing at the food before taking it from his hand with surprising eagerness. Ethan smirked, shaking his head. "Figures," he muttered. "You wait until now to start acting like you've got an appetite." He packed quickly, ensuring the cub was secure before lifting it into his arms once more. It shifted slightly, adjusting against him, but there was no resistance now, no fear. It trusted him. That realization settled deep in his chest as he stepped outside, the cold morning air crisp against his skin, the path ahead stretching wide and endless. He set off at a steady pace, his boots crunching against the frozen earth, each step bringing them closer to the clinic. The cub remained quiet in his arms, its small body warm against his chest. And for the first time since this journey began, Ethan allowed himself to believe that they would make it. The trek was long, grueling, the weight of exhaustion pressing heavier with each hour. But by midday, the first signs of civilization broke through the trees, a narrow dirt road leading toward a cluster of small buildings. Relief surged through him as he picked up his pace, the sight of the wildlife clinic standing tall at the edge of the clearing. He pushed through the final stretch, his body screaming for rest, but he didn't stop. Not until he reached the entrance. Not until the door swung open and a woman in a white coat stepped out, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of him. "Need some help?" Ethan managed, his voice rough from fatigue. The woman, Dr. Callahan, he recalled from past visits, nodded quickly, already moving toward him, her hands reaching for the cub. "Bring it inside," she instructed, leading him through the door, past the sterile scent of antiseptic and into the warmth of the clinic. Ethan carefully laid the cub onto the examination table, stepping back as the vet immediately set to work, her hands moving over the wound, checking vitals, assessing the damage. He watched in silence, his body tense, waiting, until finally she looked up, offering a small, reassuring nod. "It's weak, but it's going to make it," she said. Ethan exhaled, the weight of the past few days crashing over him in an instant. He let out a short, breathless laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Good," he murmured, his voice quieter now, rough with something he didn't quite understand. The cub turned its head slightly, its eyes flickering toward him one last time, before Dr. Callahan gently guided it back down, her focus entirely on its care. Ethan took a step back, then another, until he was at the door, the reality of what came next settling over him. This was the end of the journey. He had done what he came to do. But as he stepped outside, as the crisp mountain air filled his lungs, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just for the cub, but for him too.